Burn it! Bracken did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He picked up Staff Sergeant Maren Kessler's personnel file. 5 years of qualification scores. 5 years of confirmed hits. 5 years of a career that should have spoken for itself, and he dropped it into the metal trash can beside his desk. Then he struck a match. "Whatever Washington thinks they are doing with this attachment," he said, watching the paper curl and blacken at the edges, "it ends the moment she fails to hold this team together." The fire ate her record whole. Every score, every mission, every proof that she had ever existed as a soldier, gone to ash in less than a minute. That was the moment Maren Kessler stopped trying to earn anyone's respect in that room and started calculating exactly how long she had before the mountain made the decision for all of them. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Now let us begin. The Black Hawk touched down at exactly 0540 at a forward staging site cut into the shoulder of the Bitterroot Range in western Montana, and the rotor wash kicked pine needles and frozen grit into the air in a stinging brown curtain that smelled like diesel and cold stone. Staff Sergeant Maren Kessler stepped off that helicopter with a suppressed M2010 enhanced sniper rifle slung across her back, her boots landing on packed snow with a sound nobody in that clearing bothered to notice, because nobody was paying attention to her yet. She wore the same OCP multicam uniform as every other soldier assigned to this joint exercise. She carried the same standard tactical pack. She had the same rank insignia stitched to her collar, and the same hollowed-out look of someone who had flown across 3 time zones without sleep. But none of that mattered to the men watching her cross that clearing. What they saw was her size. 4 feet 9 inches, 27 years old. A woman who, in the words of Chief Petty Officer Dutch Farrow, looked like she belonged in a classroom rather than behind a trigger. Farrow said it out loud first. He was standing near the fuel cache with 2 other SEAL operators, Petty Officer Silas Nash and Petty Officer Ezra Colt. And when he saw Kessler come off that helicopter, he stopped mid-sentence and just stared. Then he elbowed Nash in the ribs. "You seeing this?" Nash turned, looked, blinked twice. "That's our overwatch. Can't be. That's what the manifest says." Farrow shook his head slowly, the way a man does when the world refuses to make sense to him. "That little girl is supposed to be covering our extraction." Colt crossed his arms and said nothing. He was the quietest of the 3 and the coldest. He watched Kessler walk past them without a word, and something in his stillness felt less like judgment and more like calculation. Kessler heard every syllable. She had spent 5 years training her ears the same way other snipers train their eyes, learning to isolate a whisper at 50 feet, learning to read distance and direction from the smallest disturbance in the air. She kept walking anyway, because she had learned something most people never figure out until it costs them. The moment you stop to argue with a man who has already decided what you are, you have already lost the only argument that matters. The mountain would answer their questions. Not her voice. Not her record, which no longer existed in any file cabinet on this earth. But first, she had to survive the briefing. Lieutenant Commander Holt Bracken was 39 years old, 6'3", built like something assembled rather than born. He had a way of looking at a person that felt like being scanned for structural weaknesses. When Kessler knocked on the frame of his open tent flap, he was studying a topographic map with a set of coordinates marked in the northeast quadrant and nothing else written on it. He looked up. He studied her for a long moment. Then he looked back down. "Kessler," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. Sit." She sat. He opened a thin folder and read through it without speaking for nearly a full minute. "Your orders came down separate from the joint task package," he said finally. "Yes, sir. Hold 36 hours. No confirmed kills authorized without direct verbal clearance from this position." He tapped the page. "That restriction was not issued by anyone on my staff. It came stamped with an authority code I have never seen attached to a training exercise before. Do you know who wrote it?" "No, sir," Kessler said honestly. "I follow the orders I am given. I do not always know who signs them." Bracken studied her the way he studied maps, looking for weaknesses, looking for places where things might fall apart. That bothers me more than it should, he said quietly, almost to himself. With respect, sir, the distance between a target and a bullet does not change based on which unit issued the paperwork. Something shifted in Bracken's face, not agreement. Something adjacent to it. The men will not accept you easily, he said. I do not need to be accepted, Kessler answered. I need to be positioned correctly. Bracken closed the folder. Briefing at 0800, he said. Do not be late. The briefing tent held 11 people, and the air inside was thick with the particular tension that gathers when a lot of large, confident men are packed into a small canvas space. Kessler found a seat near the back. Farrow sat 3 rows ahead, beside Nash, and leaned over to say something that made Nash snort quietly. She did not need to hear it. She had already heard enough for one lifetime. Bracken walked in at exactly 0800, and the room went quiet. The way rooms go quiet for something that recognizes authority. The way animals recognize a predator. All right, Bracken said, pulling up the tactical display. Here's the situation. The screen showed satellite terrain of a remote canyon system cutting through the northern face of the range, all volcanic rock and switchback ridgelines that from above looked like a closed fist. High-value target, believed operating out of a compound here, Bracken said, tapping a point deep in the canyon. Window for entry opens at 2200 tonight. We go in on foot through this drainage. He traced a line with his finger. 6 kilometers. Come out approximately 700 meters from the compound's rear wall. If we get eyes on the target inside that window, standard rules of engagement apply, with one exception. He looked directly at Kessler. Sergeant Kessler does not fire without my direct clearance, per her attached orders, regardless of what she observes through her optic. Am I understood, Sergeant? Understood, sir, Kessler said, though something in her chest tightened at the words. An order like that did not exist to protect a mission. It existed to protect something else, and she did not yet know what. Kessler looked at the canyon. She looked at the ridgelines flanking it on both sides. Something cold settled low in her stomach. She raised her hand. Bracken's eyes found her in the back of the tent. Every other head turned with his. Sir, the drainage route concerns me. It is the fastest route, Bracken said. It is also the only route with elevated sightlines on both flanks for nearly 3 kilometers, Kessler said, standing and moving to the display. If there is any forward security on this objective, and there will be, those ridgelines are the first place they position observers, possibly shooters. We have run canyon approaches before, Farrow said from the 3rd row without turning around. Kessler did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Bracken. There is also a weather system building west of here, she said. If it arrives during your extraction window, air support and radio contact both degrade fast in this terrain. Combine that with hostile elevation on both flanks, and a team moving through a bottleneck loses every advantage it has. The room went still. Then Farrow said, just loud enough to be heard by the men around him, but not loud enough to be officially heard by anyone. Someone is nervous. A few low chuckles answered him. Bracken raised one hand, and the room quieted again. Kessler, he said, what is your recommendation? The northeast ridge, she said, pointing. If I can be in position there before your team enters the drainage, I hold sightlines on both the approach and the compound. Full coverage. That ridge sits 900 meters above the canyon floor, Bracken said. Yes, sir. The approach in bad weather is exposed the entire way. I can make it. Bracken looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. You stay with the formation. We move as one element. That is not a discussion, Kessler. He turned back to the display and moved into communications protocol. And Kessler sat back down with the cold thing in her stomach getting colder, and she did the math. Nobody else in that tent had bothered to do. If hostiles were already dug into that ridgeline, a team of 11 walking through that drainage in failing weather was walking into a kill box that had already been built for them. She sat there and made a decision that she had not consciously made yet, but that was already becoming inevitable in the quiet part of her mind where the real decisions happen before the rest of a person catches up. The team spent the afternoon running rehearsal drills on a mock approach lane cut into the tree line south of camp. And it was during the second iteration that the first crack appeared in the wall the team had built around her. A silhouette target rose without warning at the edge of the lane, positioned by the exercise controller to test reaction time under the day's stated rules. Immediate engagement authorized for any operator with a clean shot. Farrow, closest to the angle, hesitated half a second too long. Kessler did not. Her rifle came up, sight picture acquired, crosshair settled center, mass on the silhouette in under a second, and then she lowered the weapon without firing. Farrow, recovering, put 2 rounds into the target himself and turned to her with open confusion on his face. "You had it first," he said. "Why didn't you take it?" Kessler looked at the silhouette, then at him. "Because the order says no confirmed kills without direct clearance," she said, "and this drill did not clear me for anything." "That order does not apply to training silhouettes, Sergeant," Farrow said, half laughing, half irritated. Kessler did not laugh. "It applies until someone tells me otherwise," she said. "I do not decide which rules are real and which ones are inconvenient." Farrow studied her for a moment, the irritation fading into something closer to confusion, because the answer did not match the story he had already written about her in his head 3 hours earlier. A woman too small to matter did not usually turn out to be a woman who followed orders more precisely than anyone else on the range. The second crack came an hour later, and it was the one that stayed with every man who witnessed it. The rehearsal moved into a close-quarters lane, inside a mock structure. 3 rooms built from plywood and shipping containers meant to simulate the interior of the target compound. Nash led the stack through the first doorway, and on the second room, a role player stepped from a side alcove holding a rubber training weapon raised toward the formation, a scripted ambush meant to test the team's split-second threat discrimination. Nash's weapon was already rising, finger already moving toward the trigger. When Kessler, positioned at the rear of the stack, closed the distance in 2 steps and drove the flat of her hand into the receiver of his weapon, knocking the muzzle up and off target a half-second before the simulated round would have fired. The room froze. Nash spun toward her, adrenaline still hot in his face. "What the hell was that?" he snapped. Kessler pointed at the role player's raised hand, still frozen in the doorway. "Look at his other hand," she said. Nash looked. Pinned against the role player's thigh, half hidden by the angle of his body, was a small folded card the exercise controllers used to mark a non-combatant status. A detail buried in the scenario's fine print that nobody in the stack had caught in the half-second they had to decide. "If you had fired," Kessler said quietly, "that would have gone into your after-action report as a non-combatant casualty in a training scenario designed specifically to test exactly this failure. It happens more often than anyone wants to admit, in drills and in the field both." Nash stared at the card, then at her, and the anger in his face slowly gave way to something closer to disbelief. "How did you see that from the back of the stack?" he asked. "I was not looking at the threat," Kessler said. "I was looking at everything the threat was not drawing your attention to. That is the whole job." Farrow, watching from the doorway, said nothing for a long moment. Then he looked at Kessler with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from the one he had carried since the helicopter landed that morning. It was not respect yet. It was something smaller and more honest, the first flicker of a man realizing that his certainty about another person might have been built on nothing at all. Kessler did not stay to enjoy the moment. She turned and walked back toward the staging tents, because the exercise controller had already called the next iteration, and because dwelling on being right was, in her experience, a habit that made a person slow the next time it mattered. But behind her, in the plywood structure, Nash stood holding his weapon and staring at the small folded card in the role player's hand, and something in him had started quietly rewriting a story he had been certain of for less than 8 hours. The team departed the staging site at 2100, and the storm arrived early. Mountain weather in the Bitterroots moves differently than anywhere else Kessler had trained. It builds fast and collapses faster, and visibility can drop from clear to nothing in under 15 minutes. The forecast had promised the front at midnight. It showed up at 2240. Kessler had been watching the sky change color for the last hour. She had also been watching something else. "Commander," she said quietly, moving up beside Bracken at the front of the formation. "Kessler, hold position. Sir, the ground." She swept her light briefly across the dirt ahead of them. "Those tracks are recent." Bracken stopped, looked. Wide tread marks, heavy. The kind that came from a tactical vehicle rather than a supply truck, cutting across their path at an angle heading toward the northern ridgeline. "Could be anything," Bracken said. "It is fresh," Kessler said. 6 hours at most. Wind hasn't touched the edges. Multiple vehicles moving uphill. If they moved heavy equipment onto that ridge, sir, they are not supplying an observation post. They are supplying a weapons position." Bracken looked at the tracks. He looked at the ridge. The wall of the storm was rolling closer, and the air already tasted like ground stone. "We continue the mission," he said. "That is the last time I say it, Sergeant. Fall back to your position." Kessler fell back. She moved to her spacing in the formation and passed the tracks one more time on her way, and she knew what 3 vehicles moving to high ground before a storm meant. She knew it the same way she knew what a certain silence in a forest meant, the same way she had learned in 5 years of training to read the space between visible things. The enemy was up there, and this team was walking straight toward them, and the man in command had just told her twice not to say it again. For the next several minutes, Kessler walked in formation and said nothing and thought through every variable she could control and every one she could not. At 23:58, with the storm wall 50 meters away and the world dissolving into orange static, the formation rounded a bend in the drainage, and Kessler stopped walking. The men continued forward. Nash, passing her, glanced back, something different in his eyes now than there had been that afternoon. "Keep up," he said, but there was no edge in it this time. She did not move. She looked northeast. The ridge was invisible now, swallowed by the storm. It was a guess. 3 kilometers of vertical rock and wind and darkness, with a storm already closing in, and a formation moving away from her with every second she stood still. She turned northeast and she started climbing. The climb took 4 hours. There was no trail. There had never been a trail, which was exactly why that ridge was the only position on the entire mountain that mattered. The rock tore through her gloves in the first 20 minutes. She felt blood warm against her palms by the 30th. She shifted her grip and kept moving. The rifle across her back, 16 pounds with optics, shifted with every pull, forcing her to constantly recalculate her balance. Using muscles most bodies were never asked to use for 4 straight hours in freezing wind. She had trained for exactly this. Not this specific ridge. Not this specific storm. But the principle underneath it. The idea burned into her since her first year of training that the shot you prepare for in ideal conditions is almost never the shot you actually have to take. The wind hit 50 knots on the upper face. She pressed against the rock and waited for a break in the gusts. 12 meters, press, breathe, move, 12 more. This is how the next 2 hours went, and somewhere in the middle of it, when her hands had gone past pain and into a kind of numb warmth, that experience told her was either fine or very bad. She stopped thinking about Bracken's voice telling her to hold position. She thought only about the next 12 meters, and then the 12 after that, when she finally pulled herself over the final ledge and lay flat against frozen rock, breathing in ragged pulls. The storm was so complete around her that she could not see her own hand in front of her face. She lay there for 3 minutes. Then she set up her rifle. The thermal scope cut through the storm the way a flashlight cuts through a dark room. Not perfectly, but enough. Heat signatures resolved out of the static, the pale blue of stone and ground giving way to the bright white of living bodies. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, her breath caught. 5, 7, 9 hostile signatures arranged in a pattern she recognized instantly from 3 separate training modules on enemy indirect fire tactics. It was a mortar ambush configuration, already shifting into final position. The team below had minutes, maybe less. She grabbed her radio. Overwatch to command. 9 hostile signatures, mortar configuration, northeast ridgeline. You are walking into a kill box. Break contact now, I say again. Static. Complete static. The storm had collapsed every frequency into useless noise. She tried 4 channels. Static, static, static. She looked through the scope again, through 3 kilometers of storm-driven air, and watched the bright signature of the mortar team's senior operator lifting around toward the tube. She looked at the distance. 3,150 meters. She looked at the wind, gusting variable between 40 and 50 knots. She looked at the elevation drop, 900 meters below her position. She looked at the falling temperature, which meant denser air, which meant her round would slow faster than it should in warmer conditions. She did not have a ballistics calculator. She had never needed one. An instructor had told her years ago across a 1,000-meter range, "The machine can fail. The machine will fail. You have to be the machine." She adjusted elevation. She adjusted windage. She found her natural point of aim. She found the gap between heartbeats, and in a language nobody would ever hear, alone on a summit that no one believed she could reach, she whispered 2 words before she squeezed the trigger. "Not today." The rifle pushed back against her shoulder. The round left the barrel at just over 900 meters per second and traveled through 3 kilometers of storm, and 4 seconds later, the mortar operator collapsed. Below in the drainage, the team heard an explosion with no muzzle flash to explain it. A pressure wave from a mortar round dropped in error by a man who no longer existed. Bracken spun. Contact, direction unknown. Colt had his weapon up, scanning nothing. No muzzle flash, no source. The second shot came. A communications operator on the ridge went down. Someone on the enemy position shouted in a language that was not English. 9 armed men who had built a careful ambush turned in less than a minute into a scattered group of frightened figures searching for a threat coming from a direction that should have been impossible, at a distance that should have been impossible, through conditions that should have made the shot physically impossible. But the shots kept coming, one after another, patient, measured, inevitable, like something that had already decided the outcome and was simply making it real. Bracken stood frozen in the canyon and listened to the mountain above him change. And he thought about a small woman in a briefing tent pointing at a ridge on a map, and he thought about his own voice saying the words that now sat heavy in his chest. "No, Kessler, you stay with the formation." The 9th shot came, and the canyon went silent, and Bracken looked up at a ridge he could not see through the storm and said her name out loud. Not as a rank, not as a warning, just her name. And somewhere, 3 kilometers away, and 900 meters above him, alone in the eye of a storm that had tried to stop her and failed 9 separate times, Staff Sergeant Marin Kessler chambered another round and scanned the darkness for a movement, because the mission was not over. Not by a long way. The 9th shot still echoed somewhere in the back of Bracken's skull when the sound of heavy treads on rock reached him through the storm. The vehicle rolled into the drainage before he saw it, mounted weapon already tracking, and the team scattered against the canyon walls with nowhere to actually go. "Contact front!" Colt shouted. "RPG, someone get an angle!" Rock fragments exploded off the stone above Bracken's head as the gunner found his rhythm, walking fire methodically down the line, and Bracken understood with the cold clarity combat sometimes offers that in roughly 15 seconds that rhythm would reach him. Then the vehicle detonated. Not a mechanical failure. A full engine block explosion that sent the mounted weapon spinning 30 meters through the air and lit the canyon walls in 4 seconds of false orange daylight, bright enough to punch through even the storm. When the light faded, Bracken stood up slowly from behind the boulder that had saved his life and looked at every man in his formation. All 11 accounted for, shaken. One with a bleeding forearm from rock shrapnel, every single one of them breathing. He looked up at a ridge he still could not see. He knew she was up there the way you know something that has already happened before your brain finishes processing it. In the bones. In the part of a person that runs the calculation faster than conscious thought. His radio crackled, the first transmission to break through the storm in over an hour. Thin and distant, and coming from a direction that should not have been possible. Overwatch to command. Storm is shifting northwest. You have a 12-minute extraction window. 3 additional vehicles inbound. Eastern approach. Move now! Bracken grabbed his radio. Kessler, respond. What is your position? A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. Northeast Ridge Summit. Bracken looked at Pharaoh. Nobody climbed that in this weather. She did, Bracken said. He pressed the radio again. We are moving to extraction. Can you hold? A longer pause. I have a problem, sir. Bracken's stomach dropped. Define problem. Static. I have been made. The radio went dead, and 3 hostile vehicles were 14 minutes out, and Holt Bracken stood in a canyon full of men alive because of a woman he had told twice to stay with the formation. He looked at his team. He looked at the extraction coordinates blinking on his wrist display. He looked up at a ridge swallowed by storm, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his career. We are going up, he said. Pharaoh stared at Yoshim. Sir, the extraction window. I heard the window, Bracken said. If we miss it, those 3 vehicles cut off the only road out of this canyon, and we are trapped here regardless. Then we move fast, Colt said quietly. Take the rest of the team toward extraction, Bracken told him. Tell them we have a soldier on the ridge, and we are not leaving without her. Colt held his gaze for a moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Yes, sir, he said, and started climbing. It took nearly 40 minutes for Bracken, Pharaoh, and Nash to reach the summit through the northern face, loose rock and sustained wind fighting them the entire way. Pharaoh went down twice on the lower section and caught himself both times. Bracken said nothing they could hear over the storm. He simply climbed. When he finally pulled himself over the final ledge and saw her sitting against the rock, hands wrapped in torn strips of her own uniform, 4 enemy fighters down around the summit, in positions that told a story none of them had witnessed. He stood there for a long moment and said nothing at all. 9, he finally said. 9, she confirmed, from 3,150 meters. Pharaoh crouched a few feet away, staring at the cracked scope on her rifle, at the blood on her hands, at the 4 bodies arranged around a summit that should have been unreachable in this weather by anyone alive. He opened his mouth to say something and closed it again, because there was nothing in his vocabulary built to hold what he was looking at. Bracken crouched in front of her. I told you to stay with the formation, he said quietly. I did not stay, she answered. I know you did not. He was quiet for a moment. If you had. Don't, she said. Do not do that math. It does not help anything. Bracken looked at his hands, then back up at her. I owe you more than an apology, he said. You owe me an extraction, she said. We can talk about the rest of it later. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but stood somewhere in its neighborhood. 3 vehicles. Eastern approach, he said. We have roughly 9 minutes. Then we should move, Kessler said. Yes, Bracken agreed. We should. He reached down and offered his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, thinking about the file burning in a trash can less than 24 hours earlier, about the laughter in the briefing tent, about every room in 5 years that had already decided what she was before she ever raised a weapon. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet, and Nash stepped forward without a word and took the rifle from her shoulder, shouldering it beside his own weapon. I got it, he said. She let him carry it. They began the descent together, 4 of them, storm still raging, extraction window closing minute by minute, and somewhere below them, 3 enemy vehicles were already moving through a canyon littered with evidence of what one soldier had done from an impossible distance in impossible weather. Nobody spoke for the first 200 meters. Then, near the halfway point, Bracken said quietly, the tracks on the drainage floor. Kessler kept moving. What about them? You called it before any of us saw it, he said. How? Kessler was silent for a moment, choosing her words the way she chose windage corrections, with exact precision and nothing wasted. Because I have spent 5 years learning to read what people leave behind when they think nobody is paying attention, she said. And because someone taught me a long time ago that the ground always tells the truth, even when the men standing on it do not want to hear it. Bracken said nothing to that. They kept descending, boots sliding on wet rock, wind screaming across the exposed face, and somewhere behind them on the summit they were leaving, 4 bodies lay cooling in a storm that had not weakened at all. At the 200-meter mark, with 6 minutes remaining in the extraction window and the sound of engines finally reaching them from the canyon floor below, Pharaoh, 3 steps ahead, stopped cold and raised one fist. Everyone froze. Through the storm, faint but unmistakable, came the low mechanical growl of a vehicle that had not been there 30 seconds earlier, moving fast, moving toward the base of the ridge they were still descending, and directly into the only path they had down. And somewhere behind all of it, unspoken but not forgotten, sat a question none of them had answered yet. Who had written an order that told a decorated sniper not to confirm a kill without permission, on a training exercise that was never supposed to need one? The vehicle that emerged from the storm at the base of the ridge was not the extraction team. Bracken saw the shape of the machine gun mount first, silhouetted against the last flare of daylight the fading storm allowed, and he threw one fist up without a word. Everyone dropped. Kessler was already moving before her knees hit the rock, sliding behind a boulder with the kind of economy of motion that came from 5 years of not wasting a single second on hesitation. The gunner on the vehicle swept the slope in a wide arc, searching, and for 4 long seconds, nobody on that mountain breathed. Then the vehicle rolled past the base of the descent path without slowing, engine noise fading into the wind, and Farrow let out a breath that fogged in the cold air. "Not for us," he whispered. "Not yet," Kessler answered, and kept moving. They reached the canyon floor with 2 minutes left in the extraction window, running the last 400 meters in a controlled forward stumble that was less sprint than barely contained collapse. The helicopter was already spooling when they broke into the clearing, and Colt met them at the tree line with the rest of the formation arrayed in a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. He looked at Kessler first, at her wrapped hands, at the blood dried along her jaw from an ear that had stopped bleeding an hour ago, and something crossed his face too quickly to name before he turned and led them toward the aircraft. They lifted at the exact edge of the window, rotors fighting a crosswind that had not fully died, and as the canyon fell away beneath them, Kessler watched the northeast ridge disappear into cloud one last time and did not look at it again. The flight back to the staging site took 11 minutes. Nobody spoke. The kind of silence that fills a cabin after people have used up everything they had and are simply waiting for the place where they are finally allowed to stop. Kessler closed her eyes and let the vibration of the airframe run through her, and underneath the exhaustion, underneath the ache settling into her shoulder, where the rifle recoil had punished a joint that had already given everything it had, she thought about the radio call she had made before the first shot. 9 hostile signatures. Mortar configuration. And underneath that thought, quieter. A question she had been carrying since she first opened her orders folder 2 days earlier. Hold 36 hours. No confirmed kills without direct clearance. An order that made no operational sense for a joint training exercise, issued from a command authority whose unit designation she did not recognize. An order Bracken himself had admitted he had never seen attached to an exercise before. She turned the thought over carefully. The same discipline she used to hold a windage correction steady in a crosswind, and set it aside for later, ready and waiting for the moment she needed it. The base camp at first light looked like a place that had survived something it was not built to survive. Medical personnel moved between tents. A communications officer argued quietly into a satellite phone near the command tent, and when Kessler walked past him, she caught 3 words before he lowered his voice. Task Force Greystone. She did not stop walking. She did not let her expression change, but she held on to it, the way she held on to every unexplained detail until the moment it finally made sense. Doc Ellery, the team's medic, cleared Bracken and Farrow with minor treatment and turned his full attention to Kessler's hands, unwrapping the field dressings with the careful patience of a man who had done this too many times to rush it. "This needs more than what I gave you out there," he said. "The ear, too, and something in that shoulder is not right." "I know," Kessler said. "You always know," Ellery muttered, and kept working. Nash sat across the medical tent, watching the process in silence. And when Ellery finally finished and stepped away, Nash leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "That call you made," he said. "The mortar configuration. How did you know it was a mortar team and not a fire team?" Kessler looked at him for a moment before answering. "Deployment spacing," she said. 9 men positioned in a staggered semicircle, with 2 carrying visibly heavier loads. That pattern only exists for one reason. Nash absorbed that, nodding slowly, And then ask the question, underneath the question, how did you know they would even be up there at all? Kessler held his gaze and said nothing, and the silence answered more honestly than any explanation could have. That evening, while the rest of the team ate in the mess tent, Nash found himself alone at the communications terminal, ostensibly filing an equipment report. He typed Kessler's name into the personnel cross-reference system out of nothing more than curiosity, the same reflex that made a man check a strange noise in his own house at night. The system returned her rank, her assignment date, her unit designation, and beneath it, a routing code for her order's authority, that the database flagged in red because it did not correspond to any active command structure on file. Nash stared at the code for a long moment. Then he wrote it down on a scrap of paper and folded it into his jacket pocket. And he did not mention it to anyone, not yet, because some questions felt dangerous even before a man understood why. 2 days passed in the strange suspended quiet that follows violence, the base slowly recalibrating around the fact that 11 men were alive who statistically should not have been. Farrow found Kessler at the range on the second morning, running a light zero check on a loaner rifle while her shoulder finished healing enough to trust the Barrett again. He stood at the edge of the firing line for a while before speaking. "I said some things," he began. "I remember them," Kessler said, not looking up from the scope. Farrow was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong," he said finally. 4 words. Not an apology built for an audience, just the plain cost of a man revising something he had believed with total confidence. "Yes," Kessler said. "You were." Farrow nodded once and walked away, and that was the whole exchange, and it was enough for both of them. It was Colt who first noticed the perimeter fence on the eastern side of the compound. He had gone looking for a maintenance shed and instead found a section of fencing reinforced far beyond anything a supply depot required, topped with concertina wire that had been added recently enough that the metal still showed bright where it had been cut and installed. Behind it stood a low concrete structure with a single steel door and no windows, guarded by 2 men in unmarked tactical gear who did not wear any insignia matching the Joint Task Force roster. Colt noted the observation and said nothing to anyone. And 3 hours later, in a maintenance closet behind the communications tent, he pressed a small transmitter against his collar and spoke 4 words into a channel that did not belong to this operation at all. "She is asking questions." The answer came back clipped and immediate. "Watch her. Report everything. Do not let her near the compound." Kessler noticed the guards on the eastern fence line on her second evening walk around the perimeter, a habit she maintained on every deployment, regardless of how tired her body was, because a soldier who stopped reading terrain stopped being useful. She marked the reinforced fencing, she marked the 2 guards with no unit patches, she marked the concrete structure with no windows and exactly 1 door, and she marked that nobody on the official task force roster had briefed its existence. A standard contingency practice for anything she could not fully account for. She also did something no one on that base saw, slipping a small passive locator beacon into the exposed junction box at the base of the fence line, the same model she carried into every uncertain objective, not to transmit yet, but to give a rescue element something to find if the ground ever swallowed her whole. She said nothing about any of it at dinner. She simply went to sleep with a question sitting quietly in the back of her mind that would not let her fully rest. At 0100 hours. The following night, Kessler woke without an alarm, the way she always did before something important. Some internal clock calibrated by 5 years of missions that did not run on anyone else's schedule. She lay still for a full minute, listening to the camp, and then she dressed in dark layers and moved out of her tent without waking anyone, because the questions she needed answered were not questions she could ask out loud in daylight. The eastern fence line at that hour was lit only by a single sodium lamp casting a weak orange circle over the gate. Kessler approached from the tree line, moving in the low crouched gait that kept her silhouette beneath the natural cover of brush, and she watched the 2 guards for 11 full minutes before making any decision at all. They rotated positions on a predictable 18-minute cycle, a rookie mistake for men guarding something they clearly considered important. And in the 90-second window, when both of them turned their backs to check the compound's rear approach, she moved. She crossed 20 meters of open ground in under 6 seconds. She came up behind the nearer guard exactly as he began to turn, and her forearm closed across his throat before the sound could leave him. Pressure applied with this precise economy of someone who had trained the mechanics of it 1,000 times in a gym in Kentucky, under the instruction of a man who weighed less than she did, and understood better than anyone alive that leverage was simply geometry. He went limp in 8 seconds. She lowered him silently to the ground. The second guard turned at the wrong moment and opened his mouth to call out, and Kessler closed the distance before the sound could form. A single strike to the side of the neck, dropping him before his knees, fully understood what had happened. Both men breathing, both unconscious. Neither one aware that the woman standing over them had just proven, in under 30 seconds, everything the entire task force had refused to believe about her in a briefing tent 2 days earlier. She did not go inside the concrete structure. Not yet. She had learned enough in her career to know that entering a facility she did not understand, alone, without knowing what waited on the other side of that steel door, was the kind of decision that got soldiers killed for no reason beyond impatience. Instead, she stepped to the outer wall of the structure and, using a marker taken from her own kit, wrote 5 words in block letters at eye level where anyone approaching the door would see them first. 4 spared. Ask why. Then she withdrew into the tree line and disappeared, and by the time the guards regained consciousness 40 minutes later, with pounding headaches and no memory of how they had ended up on the ground, Kessler was back in her tent, boots off, breathing slow and even, a soldier who had never left. The message on the wall reached Colonel Roland Vance within the hour, relayed by a furious radio call from the compound's security detail. Vance received the news in a command trailer 3 ridgelines away. A spare, gray-haired man in his late 50s, whose uniform bore decorations that suggested 30 years of service, and whose eyes, when he read the transcription of the 5 words scrawled on his facility, showed something closer to fear than anger. "He is careful," he said to the officer standing across the desk from him. "She, sir," the officer corrected. Vance did not look up. "Whoever she is, find out how she knew that fence line existed, find out who briefed her. And get Colt on the line," he said. "I want an answer before sunrise." Colt's answer, delivered through the same maintenance closet transmitter, was not reassuring. "She has not been briefed on anything, sir. Nobody told her. She found it on her own." Vance was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "Then find out what else she has found on her own," he said. "And if she gets any closer to that door, you stop her. Whatever that requires." The next morning, Nash finally worked up the resolve to ask someone who might actually know what the routing code on his scrap of paper meant. He found the communications officer, a young signals specialist named Dre, hunched over his terminal in the pre-dawn quiet, and he laid the paper on the desk between them. "What is this code?" he asked. Dre glanced at it, then looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" "Pulled it off a personnel file." Dre's expression tightened. "This is a task force designation," he said, lowering his voice even though the tent was empty. "Off books. I have seen it twice before, both times attached to authorization requests that came direct from the Pentagon and skipped every normal command channel in between." Nash felt something cold settle in his chest. "Whose personnel file?" Dre asked. Nash did not answer, and he did not need to because the look on his face already had. That afternoon, while cleaning weapons in the maintenance tent, Farrow overheard 2 logistics soldiers discussing supply manifests for a facility they referred to only as the Annex, a structure that did not appear on any official camp diagram Farrow had ever been issued. He said nothing in the moment. But later, walking the perimeter on an excuse about checking ammunition storage, he found the eastern fence line himself, found the reinforced wire, found the concrete structure with no windows, and found, still faintly visible where someone had tried and failed to fully scrub it away, 5 words written in block letters. 4 spared. Ask why. Farrow stood in front of that wall for a long time. That evening, the entire team gathered for a mandatory briefing that Bracken had not called, issued instead by a headquarters element none of them recognized, and Colonel Vance himself stood at the front of the tent when they filed in. He was not part of the Joint Task Force roster. His presence alone told every experienced soldier in that room that something outside the normal chain of command had just inserted itself directly into their operation. Vance introduced himself briefly, his voice smooth and practiced in the way of a man who had given 1,000 briefings and believed completely in his own authority to control a room. "There has been unauthorized activity near a secured facility on this installation," he said. "That facility falls under classification protocols above this task force's clearance level. Anyone found near it again will face immediate disciplinary action, regardless of rank or unit." Kessler sat near the back and watched him with the same stillness she had used to watch every threat she had ever faced. Vance's eyes moved across the room and landed on her for exactly 1 second longer than they landed on anyone else, and in that second she understood two things with complete certainty. He knew who had written those 5 words on his wall, and he was afraid of her in a way that had nothing to do with her marksmanship. After the briefing dismissed, Bracken caught up with her outside the tent, his voice low. "You know something about that facility," he said. "It is not a question. I know it exists," Kessler said. "I do not know what is inside it." "Yet," Bracken said. "Yet," she agreed. That night, Kessler did not sleep at all. She lay in her tent running the accumulated evidence through the same disciplined process she used to calculate windage in a storm. An order that made no operational sense, one Bracken himself had never seen attached to an exercise before. A routing code that skipped the entire chain of command. A secured facility guarded by men with no unit patches. A colonel who had appeared out of nowhere with authority. Nobody could explain, and fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with rank. Somewhere underneath all of it sat an answer, and she intended to find it before the mountain took the decision out of her hands again. At 0230, she moved. This time, she did not stop at the wall. She approached the concrete structure from the tree line exactly as before. And this time she found only one guard on duty. The rotation, apparently reduced after the previous incident, had spooked whoever commanded this detail. She closed the distance in the same practiced silence, and the guard went down without a sound before he ever knew she had crossed the open ground. She took his keycard from his vest, and she opened the steel door, and she stepped inside. The corridor beyond was narrow, lit by a single row of caged bulbs, concrete walls sweating faintly with cold. She moved down it in absolute silence, weapon low and ready, every sense running at full capacity. At the end of the corridor stood a second door, reinforced, with a small observation window set into the steel. She approached it slowly and looked through the glass into the room beyond, and what she saw stopped her breath in her chest. For the first time in 5 years of combat operations, a man sat on a metal cot in the corner of a bare cell, wrists secured to a chain bolted into the concrete floor, a beard grown wild over months of confinement, eyes that had learned to stop reacting to the sound of footsteps outside his door, because footsteps outside that door had never once meant rescue. But Kessler knew that face. She had known it for years, from a training range in Georgia, from a voice that had once told a 19-year-old woman standing at the end of a firing line that the ceiling on what she could become was so much higher than anyone had ever let her believe. Sergeant First Class Warren Bell, her first instructor. The man she had believed dead for the better part of a year, following an official report of a training accident that her entire unit had accepted without question because nobody had given them any reason to question it. She pressed her palm flat against the observation window, and Warren Bell, hearing the faint sound, lifted his head, and for a moment his eyes carried nothing but the dull exhaustion of a man who had learned not to hope. Then recognition broke across his face like something physically striking him, and his mouth formed her name without any sound behind it at all. Behind her, footsteps. Not one set. Several, moving fast, converging on the corridor from 2 directions at once. Kessler spun, weapon rising, and through the narrow slit of the corridor's far end, she caught the outline of Petty Officer Ezra Colt. Standing at the junction, radio pressed to his mouth, speaking 4 words into a channel that did not belong to this task force at all. She found him. "Move now!" Kessler understood everything in the space of a single held breath, the order that made no sense, the routing code that skipped the chain of command. The colonel's fear, the mole standing 30 feet away with a radio in his hand. Colt was not confused about her identity. Colt worked for Vance directly, and had from the beginning, and every step she had taken since arriving at this camp had been watched and reported by a man she had trusted enough to stand beside in a formation. Colt raised his weapon, and for one full second neither of them moved. Two soldiers who had shared a helicopter, shared a canyon, shared a storm, now standing on opposite sides of a line that neither of them had drawn. "I'm sorry," Colt said, and his voice carried something that sounded almost like it meant it. "Then move," Kessler answered, "because I am not stopping." Alarms began screaming through the facility. Overhead lights snapped from dim security lighting to full emergency floods, and through the thin walls, Kessler heard boots hitting gravel outside. Multiple sets, converging fast. She had seconds, not minutes. She turned back to the observation window, to Warren Bell's face pressed close against the glass on the other side, his chained hands lifting toward her in a gesture that was not quite reaching and not quite surrender, something closer to disbelief given physical shape. "I will come back for you," she said through the steel, loud enough for the words to carry, quiet enough that only he would understand them as a promise rather than a threat. Then she turned and ran, back down the corridor, past Colt, who lowered his weapon at the last possible second, and let her pass without firing, a decision that would cost him everything the moment Vance learned of it. She burst through the outer door into a night suddenly full of moving flashlight beams and shouting voices, and she did not stop running until she had cleared the fence line, until she had vanished back into the tree line that had hidden her 100 times before. And even then, she did not stop, because somewhere behind her, an entire security detail had just been ordered to find her before dawn. And somewhere ahead of her, the rest of her team was asleep and had no idea that the woman they had finally started to trust had just uncovered a secret that a colonel was apparently willing to kill to protect. She reached the edge of the main camp as gray light began bleeding into the eastern sky, and she found Nash already awake, sitting outside his tent with a folded scrap of paper in his hand, waiting for her the way a man waits when he has finally understood that a question he asked out of idle curiosity has become the most important question of his life. He looked at her, at the fresh scrape along her jaw, at the tension coiled in every line of her body, and he did not ask what had happened. He simply said, "Tell me what you need." Kessler opened her mouth to answer, and that was the moment 3 vehicles rolled through the camp's main gate, with their headlights cutting through the last of the darkness. Colonel Vance's personal security detail arriving in force, and behind them, moving on foot with a rifle already raised, came the first of the men assigned to find her before sunrise. Nash rose to his feet beside her, and across the camp, Bracken stepped out of his tent, already reaching for his weapon, and Pharaoh appeared at the edge of the mess tent with the same wall of 5 words burned into his memory that had been burned into hers. Kessler stood at the center of a camp about to fracture into 2 sides, one loyal to a chain of command that had just been exposed as a lie built to hide a man left chained in a concrete room for the better part of a year, and one loyal to whatever Colonel Roland Vance needed, protected badly enough to justify it. She had seconds to decide which side her team would end up standing on, and even less time to decide whether she would still be alive to see how that decision played out, because the nearest vehicle was already skidding to a stop 40 meters away, doors opening, and the man stepping out of the passenger side was Vance himself, his face no longer showing fear at all, only the flat, absolute calm of a man who had decided that whatever this cost him, Marin Kessler was not walking away from this camp alive. Vance stood 40 meters away with the flat calm of a man who had already decided how this ended, and for one suspended second, nobody in that camp moved at all. Then Kessler raised both hands slowly, not in surrender, but in something closer to control, and she called out across the gap in a voice steady enough to stop 3 armed men from closing the distance any faster. "You already lost this, Colonel. The camera in that corridor has been transmitting since before I opened the door." It was not entirely true. But it did not need to be entirely true. It only needed to be true enough to make a man who had spent a year hiding a chained prisoner hesitate for the half-second she required. Vance's hand, already lifting towards the security detail beside him, stopped in the air. "Stand down," he said, though his voice carried none of the certainty it had carried in the briefing tent 2 nights earlier. "Nobody fires. Not yet." He looked at Kessler across the gap of gravel and gray morning light, and something in his expression shifted from calculated threat into something closer to genuine confusion. "What camera?" he said. Kessler did not answer him directly. She turned instead to Bracken, who stood 10 meters to her left with his sidearm drawn but lowered, watching her with the focused stillness of a man waiting for a single word to tell him which direction to move. "Commander," she said, "that facility on the eastern perimeter is holding an American soldier in unlawful confinement. Sergeant First Class Warren Bell. Reported dead in a training accident 14 months ago. He is very much alive, and he is chained to a concrete floor 40 meters from where we are standing." The words landed across the camp like a physical blow. Pharaoh, standing near the mess tent, went rigid. Nash beside Kessler exhaled sharply through his nose. Even the two soldiers flanking Vance exchanged a glance that suggested this was the first time either of them had heard the prisoner's actual name spoken aloud. Vance's calm cracked for exactly 1 visible second before he rebuilt it. "This is a classified national security matter," he said, raising his voice to carry across the whole assembled camp. "Everyone standing here is now in violation of clearance protocols that supersede this task force entirely. Stand down and this ends quietly." "It does not end quietly," Kessler said. "Not for you." She reached slowly into the collar of her jacket and withdrew a small transmitter no larger than a coin, holding it up where the growing morning light caught its casing. "This has been broadcasting a location signal since I left that corridor. Every word said in this camp for the last 20 minutes has a timestamp attached to it now, sitting on a server this colonel does not control." She let the silence stretch. "If something happens to me here, that signal does not stop, it gets louder." It was, in its exact particulars, a lie built from a single true fact. 2 nights earlier, before she had ever opened the steel door, before she had ever laid eyes on Warren Bell chained to that floor, Kessler had slipped a passive locator beacon into the junction box at the base of the eastern fence line. Standard contingency practice for any objective she could not fully account for. Not to broadcast, not yet, but to give a search and rescue element something to find if she disappeared and nobody came looking. The device in her hand was not transmitting anything at all. It was at this precise moment nothing more than a dead piece of plastic and a soldier's willingness to bet everything on a man's fear outweighing his certainty. Vance stared at the small object in her palm, and something in the math he was running behind his eyes visibly failed to resolve in his favor. He had spent a year building walls around a secret that had already cost him more sleep than he would ever admit to anyone. And standing in front of him now was a 4'9" staff sergeant holding what might be a recording device, or might be nothing at all, and he could not afford to find out which by calling her bluff in front of 11 witnesses who now knew a dead man's name. "Colonel," Bracken said, stepping forward with his sidearm still lowered, but his voice carrying the full weight of command presence he had spent 17 years building. "If there is a prisoner in that facility, I am going to see him, right now. With or without your authorization." Vance's jaw worked once, twice, and then something in him seemed to fold inward, the posture of a man who understood the exact moment a situation had passed beyond his control. "Fine," he said. "Fine." Everyone stands down. He looked at Kessler with an expression that was no longer threat and no longer fear, but something closer to exhausted recognition. "You have no idea what you have just started," he said quietly. "I know exactly what I started," Kessler answered. "I started it 4 hours ago when I found him. And I started it 2 days ago, Colonel, when someone attached my name to an order that made no sense at all, unless it was written by someone who already suspected you and needed a reason to put a witness inside your camp." Something in Vance's face went very still at that, a flicker of recognition that told Kessler her guess had landed closer to the truth than she had expected. She would not learn the full shape of it until hours later, but the shape was already there in the way his eyes moved. The walk to the eastern fence line took less than 3 minutes, but it felt to Kessler like the longest 3 minutes of the entire deployment. The whole camp trailing behind her and Bracken in a loose, silent procession, Pharaoh and Nash flanking either side. Colt notably absent from the group, having vanished sometime in the confusion of the last 10 minutes. The concrete structure looked exactly as it had 4 hours earlier, Except now, the two guards who had regained consciousness stood aside without resistance, disarmed by their own colonel's silence, and the steel door swung open without a keycard this time, because nobody remained willing to defend what was behind it. Bracken went through the door first, weapon still holstered, but his hand resting near it out of habit rather than necessity, and Kessler followed one step behind him down the same narrow corridor she had run through 4 hours earlier under the screaming pull of an alarm. At the reinforced door with the small observation window, Bracken stopped and looked through the glass, and Kessler watched something break open behind his eyes at the sight of a chained, bearded man rising unsteadily from a metal cot inside a bare concrete cell. They found the key inside the guard station down the corridor, and when the door finally swung open, Warren Bell stepped forward into full light for the first time in 14 months, chains dropping away from wrists that had worn permanent grooves into the skin beneath them, and his eyes found Kessler's face and held there the way a man holds on to the one fixed point in a world that has otherwise stopped making sense. He did not say her name this time. He simply reached out, and she caught his hand before it could fall. And for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because some reunions do not need words, only the physical fact of two people who believed they would never stand in the same room again, finally proving each other wrong. "I thought you were dead," Kessler finally said, her voice lower than she intended it to be. "So did everyone," Bell answered, his voice rough from disuse, but unmistakably his own. That was rather the point. Doc Ellery arrived within minutes, summoned by Bracken's radio call, and began the work of assessing 14 months of malnutrition and confinement with the same careful patience he had shown Kessler's hands 2 nights earlier. While Ellery worked, Bracken pulled Kessler aside into the corridor, his voice low enough not to carry back into the cell. "I need the full picture," he said. "Everything, now." Kessler gave it to him in the flat, precise language of an operational debrief, because that was the only language available to her for something this large. 14 months ago, Warren Bell had been leading a small advisory element attached to a classified interdiction operation along the northern border. Working directly under then-Colonel Roland Vance's command authority, during that operation, Vance had ordered a strike against a target that intelligence had flagged as high risk but unconfirmed, overriding Bell's direct objection that the target package did not meet the threshold of certainty the mission required. The strike had gone forward. It had killed the intended target. It had also killed 3 American personnel embedded in an observation position that Vance's intelligence briefing had failed to account for, a catastrophic error that would have ended his career and likely resulted in criminal charges had it ever reached an official inquiry. Bell had filed a formal objection to the strike order before it happened, in writing, through official channels, creating a paper trail that would have made Vance's negligence impossible to bury. 2 weeks later, Bell's unit was reassigned to a routine training rotation in the Bitterroot Range, and during a live-fire exercise that Vance himself had personally authorized the parameters for, Bell had been reported killed in an accidental discharge. The official report closed the file. The written objection, conveniently, had never made it into any archive anyone could locate afterward. Howe was not dead, Kessler said, because Vance needed him alive. He needed to know whether the written objection existed anywhere else, whether Bell had told anyone, whether the whole thing could still surface. So instead of letting the accident story stand and burying a body, someone panicked and decided a live prisoner they controlled completely was safer than a dead man whose paper trail might still be out there somewhere. "And the order," Bracken said quietly. "The one that came down for you. Hold 36 hours. No confirmed kills." Kessler nodded slowly, the last piece settling into place. "I believe that order did not come from Vance at all," she said. "I believe it came from someone above him, someone who had already started asking questions about a training death that did not add up, and needed a set of eyes inside this camp who would not fire without direct clearance, who would be forced to slow down and observe, rather than simply execute a mission and leave. The restriction was never about protecting the exercise. It was about making sure I looked at everything twice before I pulled a trigger, because whoever wrote that order suspected there was something here worth looking at." Bracken absorbed this in silence, his expression darkening with each sentence. "And Colt," he finally said, Was reporting to Vance the entire time, Kessler confirmed. Probably recruited months before this exercise ever began. Likely told some version of a story that made it sound like national security, rather than what it actually was, which was one man protecting his own career at the cost of another man's life. Bracken was quiet for a long moment, staring down the corridor toward the cell where Ellery continued working. I put her through a briefing tent full of men who laughed at her, he said, more to himself than to Kessler. And she still climbed that mountain for us anyway. Kessler said nothing to that because there was nothing useful to say. And some silences carry more weight than any words could hold. Outside the facility, Farrow had positioned himself near the fence line with his rifle slung, watching the compound entrance with the focused intensity of a man determined not to let anyone slip away unnoticed. And it was Farrow who spotted Vance moving quickly toward the tree line beyond the vehicle pool, alone, no security detail accompanying him. Moving with the particular urgency of a man who had decided that whatever came next, he did not intend to be present for it. Farrow raised his weapon and called out once, a single sharp command to halt, and Vance stopped walking without turning around, his shoulders dropping in the universal posture of a man who had run out of room to run. Farrow marched him back to the compound at rifle point, and by the time they reached the assembled group outside the cell block, Bracken had already relayed a full situation report up the chain of command through a secure channel that bypassed Vance's authority entirely, reaching an inspector general's office that, once informed of a 14-month unlawful confinement of an American service member, moved with a speed that made clear exactly how seriously the allegation was being taken. That same office, an investigator later confirmed, had already opened a quiet file on Colonel Vance 6 weeks earlier, prompted by an anomaly in Bell's death report that a records auditor had flagged almost by accident, and it was that same file that had generated the strange, unexplained restriction attached to Kessler's orders before she ever set foot on the helicopter. Someone far above this camp had wanted a witness inside the wire and had never told her why. The wind had picked up by mid-afternoon, and Kessler stood near the edge of the camp watching the sky darken over the western ridgeline in the same way it had 2 nights earlier, before the storm that had nearly buried an entire formation in a canyon it should never have entered. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Bell standing there, unsteady but upright, a wool blanket around his shoulders, and the first real color returning to his face after 14 months without direct sunlight. "You climbed that ridge," he said. "It was not a question," Bracken told me. Kessler nodded once. 9 confirmed in a storm at over 3,000 meters, Bell continued, something almost like a laugh catching in his voice despite everything. "I taught you on a range in Georgia when you were 19 years old, and I told you that the only ceiling on what you could become was the one other people convinced you to accept. Did you believe me back then?" "I believed you enough to keep shooting," Kessler said. "That was enough." Bell looked out at the same darkening sky she had been watching. "There is a sound," he said quietly. "A sound a chain makes on concrete at 2 in the morning when you have stopped counting the days and started counting the hours instead. I used to run the numbers just to stay sane. Elevation, windage, drop, all of it, over and over in my head, because it was the only thing in that room that still made sense to me." He paused. "I would count backward from 1,000 and imagine I was calling a shot. Aim true. Let the truth follow. I must have said it to myself 10,000 times in that cell." Kessler felt something tighten in her chest at those words, the exact phrase he had drilled into her on a range 7 years ago. The phrase she had carried with her onto a summit 2 nights earlier without fully understanding why it had surfaced in her mind at the precise moment she needed steadiness most. "You said that to me on my 2nd day of training," she said. "I did not think you would remember." "I remembered everything," Bell said. "It was the only thing that door could not take from me." By early evening, a joint investigative team had arrived by helicopter from Regional Command, along with the 2 officers from the Inspector General's staff, whose questions for Vance carried none of the careful diplomacy that had characterized every conversation about him up to this point. Vance was taken into custody before nightfall, escorted onto a separate aircraft under guard, his career and likely his freedom, ending in the same gray afternoon light that had watched him arrive at this camp 3 days earlier, believing himself untouchable. Colt was located an hour later, hiding in a supply truck near the motor pool, and surrendered without resistance, offering in a shaking voice to cooperate fully with any investigation in exchange for consideration regarding his own culpability, a request the investigators noted without promising anything at all. That night, the camp gathered around a set of field tables that had been pushed together outside the mess tent, an improvised assembly with no formal briefing structure, no rank hierarchy enforced, just soldiers who had survived something enormous sitting together in the aftermath of it. Pharaoh found Kessler near the fire pit and sat down across from her without asking permission, the way men do when the invitation has already been earned through everything that came before. "I called you doll," he said, "twice a day, every day, since you got off that helicopter." "I remember," Kessler said. "I want you to know I do not think that anymore," Pharaoh said. "And I'm not saying it because you saved my life on that ridge. I'm saying it because I watched you walk away from a clean shot on a training range because an order told you to, and I watched you knock a weapon out of Nash's hands to save a role player's life in a drill nobody else would have noticed. And then I watched you walk into a fight against your own chain of command to pull a man out of a cell nobody else on this base even knew existed. That is not luck. That is character." Kessler studied him for a moment, reading the same small muscles around his eyes she had learned to read years ago in rooms exactly like this one. "Thank you, Senior Chief," she said. He nodded once and did not say anything else, because he did not need to. Nash approached later, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and handed one to her without a word before sitting down. "How is the shoulder?" he asked. "Complaining," she said, loudly. He almost smiled. "You knew about that routing code before I told Dre about it, didn't you?" "I suspected," Kessler said. "I did not have proof until I opened that door." Nash was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "I looked up your file out of curiosity," he said. "I did not expect it to turn into any of this. Most important things start that way," Kessler said. "Somebody gets curious about the wrong detail at the right time." Bracken found her last. Well after midnight, the fire reduced to low coals, and most of the camp finally asleep in the particular exhausted quiet that follows a day too large to fully process in one sitting. He sat down across from her without speaking for a long while, staring into the coals. "I am filing the full report myself," he finally said. "Every detail, your disobedience of a direct order on that ridge 2 nights ago, and the reason behind it, and what it prevented, and what happened here today. All of it, exactly as it happened. No corrections, no omissions." "That could affect your career," Kessler said. "Yes," Bracken said, "it could. And it will affect yours more, if the truth is buried the way Bell's objection was buried. I will not build anything on a lie twice in the same week." Kessler looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked. Bracken considered the question with the same seriousness he gave every tactical decision. "Because I burned your file 2 nights ago," he said, "and told myself it was about discipline. It was not about discipline. It was about a room full of men whose comfort I valued more than the truth sitting in front of me." He paused. "I do not intend to make that mistake again, about you or about anyone else who walks into one of my briefings looking like they do not belong there." Kessler nodded slowly, and something in the tension she had carried since stepping off that helicopter 3 days earlier finally eased, not fully, not completely, but enough to breathe differently for the first time since this deployment began. "All right," she said, "all right." Bracken agreed. The formal investigation into Colonel Roland Vance concluded 6 weeks later with charges that ranged from dereliction of duty to unlawful confinement of a service member to obstruction of a service-related death inquiry, charges serious enough to end 30 years of service in disgrace, and likely to result in a lengthy period of confinement once the court-martial concluded. Sergeant First Class Warren Bell was formally restored to active status. His death report reversed and expunged. His written objection to the original strike order recovered from a backup archive that Vance had believed permanently destroyed, vindicating in a single document everything Bell had tried to prevent 14 months earlier. Petty Officer Ezra Colt received a less clear resolution. His cooperation weighed against his complicity in ways that would take military justice considerably longer than 6 weeks to fully untangle. But the record would show, at minimum, that in the final moment inside that concrete corridor, He had lowered his weapon and let her pass. Staff Sergeant Marin Kessler received a formal commendation for independent tactical judgment under conditions of command isolation. The same language that had once been used to describe her decision to climb an impossible ridge in an impossible storm now applied a second time to a decision that had exposed a conspiracy 14 months in the making. Bracken's corrected mission record, submitted in full and without omission, became part of a training case study circulated quietly through several commands. Studied not for the tactics involved, but for the uncomfortable lesson underneath them, about what happens when an entire room decides what a person is capable of before that person has been given the chance to prove otherwise. On the morning, Kessler was scheduled to leave the Bitterroot Range for a temporary reassignment to a training command in North Carolina. She found Belle waiting near the helicopter pad. Steadier now, weeks of proper food and sunlight having returned him to something closer to the man she remembered from a range in Georgia years earlier. "You are going to teach," he said. It was not a question. Long-range engagement module, Kessler confirmed. Advanced qualification program. Belle smiled. The first full smile she had seen from him since the door of that cell had opened. "Good," he said. "Tell them what I told you. Aim true. Let the truth follow." "I intend to," Kessler said. Farrow and Nash arrived at the pad a few minutes later, and even Bracken made the walk down from the command tent despite a schedule that should have kept him occupied elsewhere all morning. Farrow extended his hand, and when she shook it, he held the grip a moment longer than protocol required. "You are a good soldier, Kessler," he said. 6 words, and from a man like Farrow, they carried the weight of a much longer speech. "So are you, Senior Chief," she answered. Nash did not shake her hand. He reached into his jacket pocket instead and produced a small folded piece of paper, and he held it out to her. She unfolded it and found a single number written in his careful handwriting. 3,150. "In case you forget," he said. "I will not forget," Kessler answered, folding the paper and placing it in her jacket pocket. And she meant it in every sense the words could carry. Bracken stepped forward last, and there was no handshake this time, only a long look between two people who had stood on opposite sides of a decision that had nearly cost 11 lives and had instead saved every one of them. "North Carolina," he said. "North Carolina," she confirmed. He nodded once, and something unspoken passed between them that neither one needed to name out loud. She boarded the helicopter as the rotor spun up, and through the open door she watched the camp shrink beneath her, the eastern fence line barely visible now, the concrete structure that had held a man in darkness for 14 months already beginning to look, from this height and this distance, like nothing more than an ordinary building on an ordinary mountain. The kind of place a person could fly past 100 times without ever suspecting what it had once contained. 3 weeks into her posting at the training command in North Carolina, Kessler stood in front of a classroom of 12 students, all selected for advanced qualification, all carrying some version of the same skepticism she had once faced on a tarmac in Montana, and she told them about a range in Georgia and an instructor who believed a ceiling was only ever as high as the people around you convinced you to accept. She did not tell them everything. Some of it belonged only to her, and to a man rebuilding his life, one steady week at a time, in a quiet town 3 states away, and to a handful of soldiers on a mountain who had learned, in the space of 3 impossible days, exactly what a person was capable of when nobody was left to underestimate her anymore. On a Friday evening in late autumn, her phone rang with a number she did not recognize, a voice on the other end identifying itself only by a designation she had never heard before, requesting her availability for a briefing the following month regarding a classified assessment role that the caller declined to describe in any further detail over an open line. Kessler listened without commitment, thanked the caller, and ended the call, and she stood for a long moment on the porch of her quarters, looking out at a tree line that reminded her, in the fading light, just slightly of another mountain 3 states away. Somewhere behind her, through the window of the small office he now occupied as a training liaison assigned temporarily to the same command, Petty Officer Silas Nash watched her standing there, phone still in hand, expression unreadable in the dusk, and he did not ask what the call had been about. He simply watched and said nothing, and let the quiet stretch, because some questions, he had learned, were better left open until the person carrying the answer decided it was time to share it.